Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics for Nintendo Switch. Today's game is Tempest for Atari 2600. Tempest was originally released to arcades in 1981, and we've previously seen the arcade version on this series. So it's one of the most well-known vector graphics games that made use of Atari's colour quadrascan vector graphics technology. So it was kind of revolutionary at the time for all sorts of reasons. Colour vector graphics, a sort of illusion of 3D. It was also a pioneer of allowing players to start at a later level and get score bonuses and that sort of thing. And that became a fixture in a lot of Atari's games going forward. Both the ones that were made in this early era of Atari gaming, and also when Atari split into its various sections and part of it became Atari Games to make arcade games like Clax and Road Blasters as well. So the Atari 2600 version we're going to see today was never actually released. It was in development during 1984, and it was originally believed to be developed by Carla Meninsky, who we've seen a couple of times previously on this series. But there's actually some debate over this. Carla Meninsky herself claims that her original prototype was lost and that this version was made by someone else long after she left Atari. And the website AtariProtos.com, which looked into the sort of dates on this prototype, seems to think that that sort of lines up with the dates when Carla was at Atari and when she left and so on. Now, unfortunately, this version of Tempest isn't terribly well regarded these days because the 2600 wasn't really up to what Tempest was offering, and you'll see why while we're playing it. So it's kind of understandable why this never made it to release in 1984, particularly with all the sort of struggles that have been going on with Atari around that time, with the great video game crash and Jack Trammell taking over and all sorts of things like that. But it's still an interesting historical artifact. They tried, at least. Anyway, let's go play Tempest. Okay, welcome back once again to Atari Flashback Classics. Today we're taking a look at the unreleased prototype version of Tempest for the Atari 2600. Now, I've had a bit of a play of this before recording this video, and it's not great, shall we say. So I don't know how long we're going to be going on for today, but I mean, we've looked through everything else on this collection so far, so even the stuff that clearly isn't particularly finished or very good is worth a look for one reason or another. And like I say, this is an interesting historical curiosity with a few questions that remain over its origin. As I say, this was originally thought to be the work of Carla Meninsky, who had done some other 2600 games, including the 2600 version of Star Raiders, if I remember correctly, and a few other bits and bobs. But as I said in the intro, Atari Protos found the date for this prototype, and it doesn't line up with the time that Carla Meninsky was at Atari. And Meninsky herself also said that this wasn't hers as well. Her prototype was lost and was different to this, and so no one really knows where this came from, which is kind of intriguing. Anyway, with this being a prototype, this is all the documentation we get. Atari 2600 Tempest is an unreleased prototype based on the arcade hit. Move along the web, destroying enemies as they emerge from its depths. Game 1, 5 lives, easy difficulty. Game 2, 3 lives, easy difficulty. Game 3, 5 lives, easy difficulty. And Game 4, 3 lives, easy difficulty. So, not everything entirely implemented in this, as you can see. Alright, well, let's get this over with. Right, let's just reset the console first of all. So we'll go with 5 lives and easy, and off we go. So Tempest, you may recall, was a vector-based shoot-'em-up in which you moved around the outside of a wireframe tube, shooting at stuff as it comes down the tube towards you. And what we have here is a rough approximation of that. That some people have described as unfolding on a pair of underpants. But you would never catch me making such comparisons. Oh, no, no. Absolutely not. Now, you'll see the basics of Tempest are in here. You have the tube to move around. You move from lane to lane on the tube. You shoot bullets down the lane of the tube towards the things that are coming towards you. And that's that. Where the problems arise slightly is in exactly how all this is implemented. So in the original Tempest, you may recall, the lanes on the tube were clearly indicated with the graphics. And in fact, it even sort of highlighted which one you were currently over the top of, which made it much easier to aim. Whereas in this one, you'll notice you tap the joystick and you either move a tiny distance like that, or you move quite a long distance that doesn't really correspond with the on-screen lanes. Not only that, but the bullets you shoot don't always correspond with the lanes either. You'll notice that, like, all of these ones out the bottom here, you're shooting straight upwards instead of down the lane in a sort of 3D direction. So in some respects, it's almost worth trying to ignore the attempt at 3D perspective in this and just treat this sort of like a fixed shooter. But the other issue we have in this is that there's so much sort of flicker and sprite priority issues that there are times when stuff just completely disappears from the screen. And you can't see it. So sometimes you can't see your own bullets. Sometimes you can't see the enemy bullets, which is probably a bigger problem. And you'll see sometimes they shoot stuff and you just can't see it. And you'll get hit by something that was completely invisible. That is a problem for a shoot 'em up. So, yeah. You see how that works. Alright, well, let's keep giving this a bit of a chance, because I mean, this isn't very good, but at least it is functional, at least. It sort of does what it's supposed to. It doesn't do it very well, but it does what it's supposed to. And it does so in a way that isn't ridiculously obtuse to the player. So when we think back at the Sword Quest games we've been looking at recently, those games are not fun to play from a modern perspective because they are so obtuse and there is no real sense of what you're supposed to be doing. Whereas in this, the core of Tempest is just about intact. The core of Tempest is there. The moving from lane to lane, the shooting things, the avoiding enemies, the attempting to stop them reach the boundary of the tube. That is all there. That is easy to understand. There's no... You can play this even without that pitiful non-manual that we have in this collection. It makes sense. It's just that none of it is implemented very well. So the collision detection is dodgy. The way the bullets disappear makes things unnecessarily difficult. The perspective is wrong. And it's just not super fun, is the thing. And it's very limited. I mean, you will see as we progress through the levels that there is a certain amount of progression in that different enemy types do gradually start showing up. Like from the third stage onwards, you start seeing those sort of egg things that carry these basic enemies inside them. So when you blow them up, it shoots out some more of these basic enemies. But to be honest, the basic gameplay is so questionably implemented. You have to wonder how many people are going to get far enough to be able to see that. See, there's one of the egg things. Oh, you do have the super zapper though. If you push up and fire at the same time, you set off the super zapper, which destroys everything on the screen. So that at least made it across intact from the arcade version. But I feel like there's just a sort of sense of disconnect in what you're trying to do in this and what actually ends up happening on screen. Like, if you look, when you shoot at things down at the side, the bullets don't actually connect with the enemies, but you still destroy them. And the same is true for enemy bullets coming towards you as well. They don't necessarily connect with you, but they still destroy you. And that just sort of makes the whole thing fundamentally quite unsatisfying. Because it ends up just feeling like a bit random. The essence of a good shoot 'em up is being able to see and understand what's going on as things get increasingly intense. Whereas in this, the visual feedback in particular is so poor that often you'll just lose a life with no idea how that happened. Like, what got me there? What hit me there? Nothing. Oh dear. Okay, so games 3 and 4 are actually supposed to be a hard mode, so let's take a look at how that makes things more difficult. Oops. See, again, nothing there, but I still died. And again, just disappears from the screen. No sense that you can actually achieve anything. Let's go back to easy. Yeah, it's not hard to figure out. It's not hard to figure out why this never got released. Now, Atari did do some fairly decent ports of Tempest. Like, the Atari ST version was relatively true to the arcade version. But at the same time, it was also one of those situations where Atari released it so late that Tempest was just not relevant at the time. It was so long between the arcade release of Tempest and the Atari ST version that by the time Tempest came out, everyone was like, well, what are you doing? So I remember my brother reviewing it and slating it for being sort of beneath what we expected from the ST at the time. Looking back on it now, that was perhaps a bit harsh, but even so. I'm sure the 2600 would have been capable of a better version of Tempest than this. In fact, if you look at something like, oh, what's it called? Is it Beam Rider by Activision? That's basically Tempest on a flat plane. And so the Atari 2600 was absolutely up to making a sort of quasi 3D shoot 'em up. Even using a rough approximation of vector graphics. Whereas I think in this case, Atari Proto said it best, in that this is an example of everything the 2600 does badly. So 2600 is bad at diagonal lines, so it's full of diagonal lines. The 2600 is bad at doing things with perspective, so it's full of stuff with perspective. The 2600 is bad at having lots of things on screen at once, so there's lots of things happening on screen at the same time. And you can see the effect that has on the gameplay. It makes it borderline unplayable. But, well, like I say, you can't fault them for trying, at least. And you also can't fault them for recognising that what they had was not good enough. Recognising what they had was not going to satisfy people who wanted the arcade experience at home. Because even by the time this would have come out, what do we say, 1984 this was in development, supposedly? By 1984 there were some really good games on the Atari 2600 that were much more complex than this, much more visually impressive than this, making much better use of the hardware than this. And so even though the proposed release of this was relatively close to the arcade version, it still would have paled in comparison to everything else going on the 2600 at the time. And so I think it was probably a wise decision that this never saw the light of day back in the day, because I mean, who knows? Tempest, the arcade game, was not as big a hit as something like Pac-Man. Didn't seep into the public consciousness quite as much as something like Pac-Man, but if this had released back in the day, we'd probably be talking about this in a similar way to how we talk about the 2600 version of Pac-Man. A not very good arcade port. That suffers from being on a particular platform that has known weaknesses and not doing anything about those weaknesses. So I'm sure they could have probably done something about the sprite issues in this, about the fact that stuff just disappears. And indeed, maybe if this hadn't been cancelled, it may have ended up a bit better, but I can only assume that there were deadlines involved. And by the time a deadline rolled around, this is what we had. And someone at Atari just had to go, well, no. Let's do something else, shall we? Let's maybe forget this ever happened until 30 years later. All this said, I do feel like I'm improving slightly. He says, getting hit by a thing that wasn't there. No, maybe not. there's just so much inaccuracy in this, I think, is the problem. And I'm not talking about it being an inaccurate arcade port. I'm just talking about how things don't really make sense. Like I say, the bullets firing in one direction, not hitting an enemy but still destroying it. And the opposite being true for you too. But, well, it is what it is. I think that's probably enough of that. Anyway, that is Tempest for Atari 2600. Worth a look for a few minutes. But beyond that, it's probably not going to hold your attention for very long. But, I mean, it exists. It's worth taking note of as an interesting and failed experiment in bringing what was at the time quite a technologically advanced arcade machine to the home. And, well, as we've talked about numerous times on this series, one of the things that developers had to do during the Atari 2600 era was sort of define what did and did not work on the home platforms of the day. And so it may well have been that they went into this project thinking, yes, we'll make Tempest for the 2600 and it will be amazing. And it might not have become clear until partway through development that they're like, no, maybe it's not going to be quite as amazing as we initially thought. But anyway, it's interesting that we can experience it today. So we should thank the desiccated corpse of Atari for dredging this up from wherever it was discovered and putting it in this collection for us to enjoy. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.